Welcome back to the World Islam Expo Podcast. You know we love diving into thought-provoking topics. And today we're tackling a big one, how the Quran and Sunnah can guide us in governing in today's world.
Sounds ambitious.
It is, but that's what makes it exciting, right?
Absolutely.
We're basing this deep dive on an article from the World Islam Expo itself. It really focuses on the practical side of things, like how can we actually use these ancient principles to build a society that's fair and just?
It's a great question. And what I find fascinating is how the article presents the Quran and Sunnah not just as, religious texts, but as a practical guide for leaders, for creating a just legal system, even for ensuring the well-being of the entire community. It's pretty broad.
It is. It's like this incredible toolkit for building a better future. And that's what we're going to unpack today.
Sounds like a plan.
So where do we even begin?
Well, the article starts with those core principles you were talking about, the bedrock.
Right. The Quran talks a lot about justice, equity, accountability, like the ingredients for a morally strong society.
Exactly, but it's not just about stating those values. The Quran lays out how to actually apply them, right?
Oh, I see. It's like giving us the blueprint and the instruction manual.
Exactly, and one of the key concepts it highlights is Shura, which means consultation.
Shura.
Yeah, and it's all about preventing oppression, making sure that everyone's voice is heard and considered.
Okay, so Shura is kind of like ancient wisdom meets modern democracy in a way.
That's a good way to put it.
But how do you actually do that in our world today? Everything moves so fast, it's hard to imagine slowing down enough for deep consultation.
Right, but if you look at the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was a master of Shura. He actively sought advice from his companions. He valued their different perspectives, their experiences, their knowledge. It wasn't about him making all the decisions in isolation. It was about fostering this culture of open dialogue and collaboration.
So it's less about a specific method and more about cultivating a certain spirit or approach to decision-making?
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to share their ideas, to challenge assumptions, to work together to find the best solutions.
That makes a lot of sense. And what's cool is the article talks about some really innovative ways to apply Shura in the 21st century.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It mentions things like public forums, online platforms, even using technology to get real-time feedback from citizens. There are so many creative ways to bring people into the decision-making process.
It's like taking this ancient principle and giving it a serious digital upgrade. But Shura is just one piece of the puzzle, right?
Right.
What are some other key elements of modern Islamic governance that the article dives into?
One that really jumps out is the focus on social justice and establishing strong welfare systems.
Okay, tell me more about that.
For example, zakat. One of the 5 pillars of Islam, it's not just about individual charity. It's about creating a system where wealth is redistributed in a way that benefits the whole community.
So it's about providing a safety net, but also about tackling the root causes of poverty and inequality.
Precisely. The article argues that modern Islamic governance shouldn't stop at just meeting immediate needs. It should aim to create sustainable solutions. Solutions that lift people out of poverty for good, that empower them to become self-sufficient.
I love that idea. It's about empowering people, not just providing temporary relief.
And that brings us to another fascinating area, Islamic economic principles, for example, the prohibition of interest, which is known as riba in Arabic.
Oh yeah, riba. I've heard about that. It's such a radical departure from conventional economics. But in a world struggling with debt and financial crises, it's kind of really intriguing.
Right. It makes you think, are there other ways to do finance? Can we have an economic system that's both ethically sound and economically viable?
It's a big question.
It is. But the article actually explores some possibilities. It talks about things like cooperative businesses, socially responsible investments, basically models that prioritize fairness, transparency, and shared prosperity, not just profit.
So it's about creating an economic system that benefits individuals and communities, not just corporations and the wealthy.
Yeah, exactly. And that aligns with the core principles of Islamic teachings, right? Taking care of the vulnerable, promoting fairness, and ensuring everyone has a chance to thrive.
Okay, so we're seeing how these foundational Islamic principles can be applied to everything from governing to economics, potentially creating a more just and equitable society. But I imagine there are also challenges to implementing these ideas, right? The real world is messy.
You're telling me, and the article acknowledges those challenges.
Like what? What are some of the hurdles?
Well, one of the biggest is finding that balance. How do we stay true to the core values of Islam while adapting to a constantly changing world? Think about technology, the pace of change, the diversity of our societies. It's a lot to juggle.
It's like walking a tightrope. You want to hold on to those timeless principles, but you also don't want to be stuck in the past.
Exactly, and that's where dialogue and interpretation come in. The article stresses that it's not about blindly following rules. It's about engaging with the texts, having those tough conversations, getting input from scholars and experts, even everyday people.
So it's about bringing those principles to life in a way that's relevant to today's challenges.
Absolutely. It's a collaborative process, the whole community figuring out how to make these teachings work in our modern world.
I love that. It's about finding solutions together.
But of course, that doesn't mean it's easy.
Oh, I bet. What are some of the specific challenges?
Well, one that comes up a lot is the issue of interpretation. There are different schools of thought within Islam, and that diversity is a beautiful thing. But it can also lead to disagreements about how to apply certain principles.
Right. So how do you navigate those differences while still upholding the core tenets of the faith? Seems like a delicate balancing act.
It is, and the article suggests a few key things: open dialogue, a strong emphasis on consensus building, and having clear governance frameworks that are grounded in Islamic principles but also take into account modern legal norms. It's about finding that sweet spot.
So it's about creating a system where people can respectfully disagree, but ultimately work together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point the article raises, the potential for misuse of authority.
Oh, right. Anytime you have a system of governance, there's always the risk that someone might abuse their power.
Absolutely. And the article is very aware of that. It stresses the importance of transparency and accountability.
So having checks and balances in place to make sure that no one person or group can exploit the system for their own gain.
Exactly. Things like a free press, strong judicial systems, even using technology to make information more accessible to the public. It's about empowering citizens to hold their leaders accountable.
These are all really important points, but I'm also curious about real-world examples. Are there places where Islamic governance has actually been implemented successfully or unsuccessfully? Like, how do these principles play out in practice?
That's a great question, and it's one of the article tackles head on. Now, there's no single perfect model out there, but there are several countries that have incorporated elements of Islamic law and principles into their systems.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those examples. What are some of the successes and challenges they've encountered?
Let's start with Malaysia. It's a really interesting case study. They actually have a dual legal system.
A dual system.
Yeah, so they've got Islamic law, Sharia, running alongside secular law, and they have Sharia courts that handle things like marriage, divorce, inheritance for the Muslim population.
So it's kind of like creating a system that respects religious values and the practical needs of a diverse society.
Exactly. And it's been pretty successful, especially in rural areas where people might not have easy access to other legal services. The Sharia courts are often seen as more accessible and efficient.
That makes sense. But are there any downsides to this dual system?
Well, there have been some criticisms. Some people argue that it can create inequalities or even conflicts between the two systems, and there are concerns about how it impacts freedom of religion and the rights of minorities.
So it's like any system. There's always room for improvement in making sure everyone's rights are protected.
For sure. But it's interesting to see how Malaysia is trying to find that balance. Now, another example the article mentions is Iran.
Okay, Iran, that's a very different context.
Right. After the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran adopted a system of governance based on Vilayat-e Faqih. It means guardianship of the Islamic jurist.
Guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Okay, break that down for me. What does that actually mean in practice?
Basically, it means a leading Islamic scholar has a lot of authority. Like, they oversee the government and make sure everything aligns with Islamic teachings.
So it's like having a religious leader at the helm of the state.
Exactly. And Iran has implemented a lot of policies based on Islamic principles. Things like interest-free banking and social welfare programs to reduce poverty.
That sounds pretty progressive.
In some ways it is, but Iran has also faced a lot of criticism from international human rights groups. There are concerns about freedom of speech, political dissent, and the rights of women and minorities.
It seems like finding that balance between religious values and individual liberties is an ongoing struggle.
It definitely is, and it highlights the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to Islamic governance. What works in one context might not work in another, and cultural and social dynamics play a huge role.
Right, context is everything, but it's not just about Muslim-majority countries, right? The article also talks about Islamic governance ideas gaining traction in Western countries, too.
Absolutely. There are growing movements within Muslim communities in the West who are advocating for incorporating Islamic principles into things like education, family law, and ethical finance.
So it's less about creating a separate Islamic state and more about finding ways to live by Islamic principles within their existing societies.
Exactly. And it's not just about asking for special rights or anything like that. It's about having constructive dialogue, participating in the democratic process, and working to build a more just and equitable society for everyone.
That's encouraging. It sounds like a really positive movement. But I imagine there are also challenges unique to trying to implement these ideas in societies that are largely secular.
Oh, for sure. One of the biggest challenges is navigating the tension between religious values and secular laws. Like, some Muslim communities in the West want to use Islamic arbitration to resolve disputes, but that raises questions about the role of religious law in a secular system.
Right, because you have to respect religious freedom, but also uphold the rule of law for everyone.
Exactly. It's complex and it requires a lot of nuance, but the good news is that these conversations are happening. There's a growing understanding that ethical values matter, whether they're from religion or elsewhere, and they can help create a better society for all.
That's a good point. It's not about forcing beliefs on anyone. It's about finding common ground and working towards shared values.
Right, and the article suggests that we need to move away from this us versus them thinking. It's about embracing pluralism and respecting each other's perspectives, even if we disagree.
Okay, so we've talked about the principles, the challenges, and the potential for positive change. But the article actually goes a step further and offers a framework for implementing modern Islamic governance.
Right, it lays out this really practical three-phase approach.
3 phases. Tell me more.
The first phase is all about assessment and planning. Like, before you build a house, you need a blueprint, right?
Makes sense. So what does this assessment phase look like?
It involves taking stock of the existing situation. What are the key challenges? What are the needs of the community? What are the resources available? And it emphasizes wide consultation, talking to religious scholars, legal experts, community leaders, and just everyday people.
So it's like gathering information, understanding the context, and developing a shared vision for a more just and equitable society.
Exactly. And once you have that foundation, you move into the implementation phase.
This is where the rubber meets the road, right? Putting those principles into action.
You got it. This involves things like concrete policies, legal reforms, creating new institutions. Like, if you're talking about Islamic finance, you might need to reform the banking system or set up new institutions that operate according to those principles.
I imagine that takes a lot of collaboration, different groups working together to make it happen.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just the government's job. It's about religious bodies, community organizations, individuals, everyone playing a role.
Okay, so you've assessed, you've planned, you've started implementing. What's the third phase?
It's all about monitoring and evaluation, making sure things are working the way they should be.
So checking in to see if those policies are actually having a positive impact.
More than that, it's about being flexible. If something's not working, you need to be able to adapt, make adjustments, and keep learning as you go.
So it's not about setting up a rigid system, but one that's responsive and constantly evolving.
Precisely. And that requires ongoing dialogue, open communication, and being willing to learn from both successes and mistakes.
That makes a lot of sense, but are there any real-world examples of this three-phase approach in action? Like, has it actually worked somewhere?
The article highlights some inspiring examples, like there are a bunch of Islamic relief and development organizations doing amazing work around the world.
Oh, interesting. Tell me about them. What kind of work are they doing?
Well, they're tackling poverty, providing healthcare, promoting education, in some of the most vulnerable communities around the world. And they're doing it all by using Islamic principles like zakat and sadaqah, but not just in a symbolic way. They're actually using these principles to create sustainable and effective programs. It's really impressive.
That's awesome to hear. Do you have any specific examples, like projects that have made a tangible difference?
Yeah, definitely. One that comes to mind is Islamic Relief's microfinance program.
Microfinance, how does that work exactly?
Well, they provide small loans to entrepreneurs in developing countries. So people who might not have access to traditional banking can get the capital they need to start their own businesses. And because it's based on Islamic principles, the loans are interest-free.
Oh, that's a really cool idea. So it's like empowering people to become self-sufficient, not just giving handouts.
Exactly. And it's been incredibly successful, not only in helping individuals, but also in boosting local economies. It's a real win-win.
I love that. Are there other examples?
Oh, there are tons. Another one I find really inspiring is the Aga Khan Development Network.
The Aga Khan Development Network. I've heard of them.
They're doing fantastic work, mostly in developing countries with large Muslim populations. They focus on things like healthcare, education, infrastructure, like building hospitals, schools, roads, that kind of thing.
So it's about addressing those basic needs that are so essential for communities to thrive.
Yeah, but what's really cool is their approach. They really emphasize community involvement and local ownership. So it's not just outsiders coming in and imposing solutions. It's about working with the communities to figure out what they need and how to make things sustainable in the long run.
I like that. It's about empowering communities to help themselves.
Exactly. And it's a really powerful model for development work in general.
It's amazing to see how those Islamic teachings are being put into action to make a real difference in people's lives.
It is. It shows you that these principles aren't just abstract ideas, they can actually transform communities.
Well, I think this has been a super insightful conversation. Before we wrap up, I did want to touch on the Q&A section in the article. It's got some great takeaways and might answer some questions our listeners might have.
Yeah, let's hit some of those highlights.
Okay, so the first one is pretty basic. What are some of the benefits of actually implementing Islamic governance?
Well, the article lists a bunch, but one of the big ones is creating a society that's grounded in ethics and social justice, like a system that truly values human dignity and well-being.
So it's about creating a system that puts people first.
Exactly. And that can lead to all sorts of positive outcomes, like more social harmony, less crime, a stronger sense of community, people working together for the common good.
That's beautiful. Here's another question. How can everyday people contribute to promoting Islamic governance? Like, if you're not a politician or a leader, what can you do?
That's a really important question because it highlights that Islamic governance isn't just about top-down structures. It's about individuals living by those values in their daily lives.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly, like being honest in your dealings, treating others with kindness and respect, standing up for what's right. It's about embodying those values in everything you do.
It's about those individual actions that, when you multiply them across a society, can really create a ripple effect.
Right. And that's how real change happens, from the ground up.
I love that. Now, one last question that I think a lot of our listeners might be wondering. Where can people learn more about this, about Islamic governance and how to apply these principles in their own lives?
That's a great question. And the article actually points to a bunch of resources. There are books, articles, online platforms. You can really dive deep into Islamic political thought, legal systems, ethical frameworks.
So it's about taking that initiative to learn and grow.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right? And the more we understand these concepts, the better equipped we are to create positive change.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an amazing conversation, really eye-opening.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Islamic governance. Remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore, so keep learning, keep asking questions, and join us for future episodes as we continue to unpack the richness and wisdom of Islam. Peace be upon you.